Welcome to the School of Rock Bottom podcast with Oliver Mason. I'm an actor, a voiceover artist, a performing arts principal, and also a mental health coach, and I freelance in private rehabs. It's all these passions and careers combined that have given birth really to this podcast. And this is an interesting fact. Those that are working in performing arts and in the creative industries are twice as likely to suffer from depression and up to 10 times more likely to suffer with an anxiety disorder. So on this podcast, I'm going to be inviting really amazing creatives to come on here. And these are people that have experienced the rock bottom themselves, but they have survived. And these stories are really important to be told so that people realize that no matter how dark things get, there is always a way out. We're also going to be talking about how to protect your mental health whilst working in these creative industries. I'm really excited because I've got an amazing guest with me today. I've got the wonderful David Schaal with me. How you doing, David?
I'm good, thanks.
It's really great to see you. Now, I'm just going to give David a little intro, not that he needs many. I just was having a little look on IMDb, and I noticed that you've got 114 credits.
You've added them up.
I've added them up. Well, actually, it tells me at the top. Now, I know one of your idols is Gary Oldman.
He is.
And he's got 107. So
What?
you're currently beating Gary Oldman, which I think is pretty impressive.
That is the best stat I've ever heard.
There you go. Now, you might recognise David from all kinds of things. He's arguably best known for playing Taffy in The Office and, of course, Jay's dad in The Inbetweeners. And actually, I've just poached him from a rehearsal because he's about to go off on tour. So I've actually got him just in time. I'm just going to make sure I get this right. It's a new play, and it's called Jumping the Shark, written by my family writer, David Cantor, and Michael Kingsbury, who's also directing it.
That is correct.
Did I get that right?
That is absolutely bang on.
Brilliant. This podcast is quite different because at the top, I just like to get straight in there, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm going to ask you arguably maybe the most difficult question of this entire podcast. I've invited you on, David, not only because you're a brilliant actor and a friend as well, but I know that you've had, lots of things happen in the past which I think could really inspire and help people. I know you've gone through a rock bottom moment yourself, and obviously one of the cliches around rock bottoms is that there's this one isolated incident. A lot of people have many of them. And really, I just wondered if you could take the viewers and the listeners to that place of one of your rock bottoms or a rock bottom. Try and describe to us what that was like, maybe how old you were, where you are, and try and really describe what was going on for you, if that's okay.
Okay. Yeah. So I've had a couple. The most recent one happened just 5 years ago. Well, actually 4.5 years ago. So it was 2018. I was married. I was about to say happily married, but I'm not sure my ex-wife would say we were happily married. But we were married, and I was living together, jogging along quite well. My career was sort of going okay. Life was all right. And then I met a woman, and I fell head over heels in love, lust, whatever you want to call it, at first sight. And what happened after that led to me getting divorced, led to a very, very destructive relationship, and led to me feeling suicidal. So a year after meeting her, I was on the phone to the Samaritans,
Right, wow.
telling them that I was going to sit in a bath, open my veins, and drink a bottle of whiskey. I'd planned how I was going to do it. So the Samaritans were very good. They just sort of listened to me, and I'm a member of several 12-step fellowships, and I went to some of these fellowships as well, which I have to say were very helpful in me dealing with the immediate pain that I was in. And so over a period of time, I sort of managed to get back to the point where I wasn't suicidal, but the damage to my emotional life was devastating. I mean, I'm only just recovering from it now,
Yeah.
and this was 5 years ago. So that was probably the worst rock bottom of my whole life.
Wow.
But I also had another one in my late 20s, early 30s, really, that period of time. And that was to do with alcohol consumption.
Right.
And I was, a self-diagnosed alcoholic, and I went and got some help for that. And I basically, I dealt with that over a long period of time. But it took me until my late 30s to sort of get sober. So I had a history of drinking a lot from the age of about 14 when I started drinking cider and, discovered punk rock and going to all these punk rock gigs. So my journey from the age of 14 right the way to my late 30s was the development of alcoholism and me trying to function while all this was going on. So I think I mention that because I think it's connected to what happened a few years ago. So I managed to deal with all the stuff around alcoholism, but I think there remained in me a level of addiction to other things.
Right.
So, there's this saying that, it's like a piece of sheet metal with lumps on it. You whack one and another one pops up, you whack another down. And that's certainly been my...
like the game whack-a-mole kind of thing.
Like the game whack-a-mole, yeah, exactly. I always think of it as sheet metal for some reason. So I think also my chosen career to be an actor, I think it's really interesting that creative people are more prone to depression and anxiety, because I always wondered whether I was like that because of the career that I've chosen to go into. But I think the way I am has attracted me to that kind of career, the career.
That's really interesting. And I think, when you describe the rock bottom that was quite recently, I think someone listening to that would think, wow, how did you sort of get out of that? I mean, you say you're still recovering from it.
Yeah.
But then you mentioned another rock bottom that was many years earlier.
Yeah.
Although you might only just have passed, early 20s. But, I'm assuming a few years later.
Yeah.
Do you think those experiences that you had when you were younger helped you in that situation that you just described? Because, for example, you said, you re-engaged with 12-step fellowships, for example. It sounds like you had some tools at your disposal.
Yeah, it wasn't so much I re-engaged. I was going to the 12-step fellowships all the time.
Right.
And in fact, I met this woman I'm talking about in one of those 12-step fellowships.
Sure.
And that was the devastating thing about it, that, my recovery lifeboat, if you like, had become kind of tainted by the fact that I had this very destructive relationship and I felt I couldn't go back. So that's been the reason why it's been such a problem recovering since, because I had to avoid my local meetings and what I've actually done is I've replaced those meetings for a time with therapy.
Right.
So I managed to get into counselling about 2 years ago.
Right.
And and that's really helped, because you start looking at all these childhood wounds and, sort of it's psychodynamic counselling, which is making the unconscious conscious.
Yeah, sure.
So all this stuff that happened in my formative years, a bit of abandonment, my poor mother having had 5 kids, she couldn't give all the attention required to each child. So I think a lot of my siblings have experienced a similar thing, this kind of abandonment, anxious attachment kind of thing. That's what I discovered through therapy. And I've altered my attachment style in relationships since that.
Right.
And it feels slightly odd, and I realized that when I gave up drinking, I made a pact with myself in my late 30s. I was like, fine, I'll give up the booze, but I'm not giving up anything else.
Right.
So women was a major thing. And I kind of had an understanding that I had an issue around, what I guess you would describe as love addiction in particular.
Right.
A bit of sex addiction as well, but mainly love addiction was my big thing. So I would sort of have this fantasy idea about almost any woman I found attractive. And I'd run in my head this whole kind of history, oh, it's all going to be happily ever after, and we're going to have the wedding, we're going to have this idyllic relationship. Well, that's fine, but the problem with that was 5 years ago I was actually married,
right?
And my marriage, albeit not perfect in every respect, was a good marriage, well, at least I would say so. And it kind of came out of the blue, and my wife was very shocked. But she had said to me, if you ever, cheat on me or meet somebody else, that's going to be the end of our relationship. And she was very true to her word about that.
Yeah.
So I knew as soon as I told her that I had fallen for someone else, I knew that my marriage was over, even though we, even though we carried on living together for about a year. And in the end, she saw what state I was in to do with this relationship I got myself into. And my ex-wife, who was living in the flat, I mean, we were, still technically married at that point. She ended up being my counsellor. God bless her.
Right.
And she wouldn't leave the flat for her own place until she knew I was okay.
Wow.
So I was very grateful to her for that, and we're still good friends now.
Wow. I mean, yeah. What a friend. And I mean, the way you're talking is obviously someone that's obviously very, very self-aware and has been on a huge journey and really knows himself well. I mean, all the language and the way you describe it, that's really evident. I even noticed when you described at the beginning, talking about drinking, you said self-diagnosed alcoholic.
Yeah.
And that really struck me, because that's something that often alcoholics don't do, self-diagnose, or if they do, it's. But it sounds like it was something that you were aware of quite early on. I was just interested in that, because obviously denial is a big part of addiction, and where did that sort of clarity come from? Because even when you're talking about the latest stuff, it's all framed around language that has a great deal of clarity that you're quite aware of.
That's recovery speak. I mean, that's one of the 12-step fellowships, really, recovery. And in fact, what it says is the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking.
Yeah.
So when people were diagnosing me, particularly in my late 20s, when I'd really spiraled out of control, when people started diagnosing me as an alcoholic, then I was in complete denial about it.
Right.
I was like, I'm not an alcoholic. What are you talking about?
Right.
You lot are just boring,
Yeah.
And because all through my life, people around me had drunk exactly like I did. And then when I started meeting, in inverted commas, normal people, normal drinkers, they sort of started drawing attention to it, and I didn't like it. Right. So it took me to go to a 12-step fellowship in order to get the understanding.
Right.
And, the AA definition of alcoholism is that you have the obsession of the mind.
Right.
And that's what draws you to the drink. And then when you pick up the first drink and you take the drink, it's the allergy. Mm-hmm. So you then once you take that first drink, you then become allergic to it. And that's my understanding of alcoholism. And for me, it's really important because alcohol was on my mind all through my late teens and early 20s. I'd play a game of football. I'd want to have a bottle of wine. I'd have a bottle of wine. I'd want to go and get another bottle of wine.
Wow.
And from a pretty early age, I started isolating. So it started off very gregarious, but then I wouldn't move away from my local pub. And, and I'll never forget this, quite near the end of my drinking, a friend of mine was doing a play in Stratford, and I live in North London, and I could not physically get myself out of the pub to go and see her play.
Right.
And she was one of my close friends, and she had her own struggles, and it was really important to her for me to get there. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to go. 10 o'clock, when the play was probably done by then, I was still sitting in the pub going, yeah, I'm going to get there. And so, if I tried to stop, I thought about it all the time. And I wanted to drink every night.
Right.
And often I'd wake up in the morning and I'd think, a drink would be nice. But luckily for me, I didn't quite get to that early morning drinking, although I did do a few hair of the dog sessions at weekends. So it was on my mind all the time. And the biggest relief to me was that when I stopped drinking, pretty quickly, actually, it went. Right. I was no longer obsessed with it.
Right.
And I remember my first year of sobriety, even though it was difficult to keep it going, I was really enjoying the relief of it not being on my brain all the time, you know.
Right. And I noticed, sorry to interrupt
That's
you.
all right.
I noticed early on when we were talking about it, you sort of jumped from, you know, the rock bottom you described 5 years ago and then jumped quite far back. And then you sort of referenced that there could be a parallel between this relationship and the alcohol. Because if I'm right in saying you've not had a drink in many, many years.
20 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you think, or is it too easy to make this call that there is a direct link between the two, the way that you responded to the relationship and the rock bottom that you mentioned? And if so, how do you think that there is a link?
I think there is a link, and I think it's an addictive mindset.
Right.
So I think the way that I approached alcohol was very similar to the way that I approached relationships. I want it to be New Year's Eve all the time.
Right.
You know. And
Don't we all?
yeah. You know, you're going out for a drink? Yeah. You're going to have one? No, it's going to be New Year's Eve. It's going to be the best drink ever. You're going to have a girlfriend? No, I'm going to have a love. I'm going to have the best love of my life. It's going to be the idyllic, perfectionist love.
And what happens neurologically in the brain, of course, you know, when you take a mind-altering substance and falling in love and sex and all of those things is almost the same thing. So it makes sense.
Yeah, it is exactly the same part of the brain, I believe.
Yeah.
And I've discovered in therapy that I'm also a perfectionist. So if a relationship starts going wrong, I can't cope with it.
Right.
And the flip side of love addiction is love avoidance. And this is what confused me so much because I was involved in this relationship, and when it started going wrong, instead of trying to talk it through, I would just exit and go, you know, I can't deal with this, I'm off. So my response to the kind of stress of the relationship, which is probably a, you know, self-preservation response, was to get out of there.
Right.
And then nothing ever got resolved. So we were just always angry at each other. I suspect if I'd have had the tools of negotiation, which I've subsequently learned in recovery, and to be fair to the 12-step program, they do, you know, I wouldn't exactly say teach this, but that's on offer in these fellowships. If you go regularly enough and do the program, you do learn these kind of negotiation skills. But I wasn't able to do it under duress.
Right.
So I could count to 10 if I'm having an argument with a friend, but for some reason in a relationship, I wasn't able to see it from their point of view. It would go straight to my kind of instincts.
Right.
And my instinct was to, you know, either fight back or run away.
Right.
So I had to learn to stop being in my emotional head and get into my wise head. And it's an easy thing to do for me with friendships or even with my family.
Yeah.
I could not do that in a relationship.
Right.
And because everything that, especially this person who I got involved with 5 years ago, everything that she said triggered a childhood wound.
Right.
You know, made me feel less than and inadequate. So my response to that was to react.
Right.
And even though years and years of, you know, these 12-step programs teach you to, you know, have serenity, be calm, you know, don't have an emotional response, all of this stuff is a kind of spiritual approach to life. I could not do that.
Couldn't access it in that
when
moment.
it came to relationships. And, you know, I've spent the best part of these last 5 years blaming her, 4.5 years, blaming her for what happened. Only now am I understanding that my own responses to the way she was behaving weren't helpful.
Right, sure.
You know.
And going back to that moment that you described with the bottle of whiskey 5 years ago, what do you think it is inside you that made you not go through with that? Because, you know, what you're telling is a story of a survivor, somebody that's been faced with a very, very dark moment, but yet, you know, didn't go through with it. You know, living in the solution. You know, you're doing a play at the moment. You've got a great life. What is it in you, do you think, that harnessed that power? What is it in your character, do you think, that?
I'm gonna do a slight diversion. I remember back in the 70s, there was this amazing TV show called Helen, a Woman of Today. And I can't remember the actress in it, but I think Martin Shaw was the actor. And he was this like horrible alcoholic, and he kept saying, yeah, I'm going to get off the booze. I'm going to get off the booze. And he never could get off it.
Right.
And I remember thinking in those days, just stop drinking, mate. You know, you're ruining your life. You got this beautiful woman and you're ruining your life by drinking and being mean to her. So part of me's always thought, you know, I'm not the kind of person that's going to end up, victim of a drink and drug problem or, you know, in these hostile relationships.
So it's like a survival mindset. You think you've kind of got that. And I know, looking at your childhood, and you were born in America.
I was,
yeah. And your dad was American. He was in the Air Force. Was that part of your upbringing, sort of a sort of stiff upper lip? I'm sort of imagining it, you know, a very tough military guy that...
No, my dad was the opposite.
Right.
He was in the American Air Force. And he was probably the worst soldier they ever had. In fact, he got stripped of his sergeant stripes for not towing the line. Right. My dad was a very sensitive, you know, kind of empathetic guy. He wasn't like your army captain or something like that.
Right.
So I'm very lucky about that. But what did happen was when I was a kid, we kept moving around all over the place. So I was a new kid at this school, new kid at that school. You always end up getting bullied or having to have fights. So I think that created anxiety in me.
Right.
And when I got to my final school in Stevenage, which is now closed down, it was such a bad school, you know, I got horribly bullied in that school. But I also was introduced to music by a good friend of mine. And
you were a punk rocker, I think.
I was a punk rocker, yeah. Hard to believe, isn't it? Yeah, one of the first gigs I ever saw was Adam and the Ants, supported by Generation X at the Electric Ballroom. And that was in 1978. So that was, shows how old I am. But I think music then became an outlet. And then subsequently I discovered theatre, and then that was it. That was a place where I could feel at home and put all of this anxiety and these weird impulses I had, you know, channel it into something creative.
Right. And when you talk about the drinking when you were younger as well, it seems like it hasn't got in the way of your career. It sounds like you sorted it, for want of a better word, quite early. I mean, looking at your CV, for example, it seems like you've worked pretty regularly.
More films than Gary Oldman.
There you get more films than Gary Oldman. How did it impact your career? It sounds like it was something that you had to deal with quite young.
Yeah.
Is it something you nipped in the bud quite quickly, and work served as a distraction, something you could throw yourself into?
Yeah. Well, I was very lucky that I had a really good friend who recognised what was going on with me, because I told you everybody around me was diagnosing me as an alcoholic, and I felt, you know, shame, and I was in denial. But a good friend of mine was actually in the 12 Steps fellowship.
Right.
And he said to me, I think you might have a drink problem. Right, you know, if you want to go to a meeting, I'll take you to a meeting. And I was like, I don't know. And then I went to Germany to do a play, and I had a steady relationship over here. So I get over there, start drinking like a fish. We were doing this American play called Killer Joe by Tracy Letts.
Right.
So, you know, it was all...
Did the drinking help the part? It sounds like it could have done with a
it was part
with a title. Like
it's part of the character research. And then I started taking cocaine, which I'd never taken before.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've subsequently discovered I've got an ectopic heartbeat, which skips a beat.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with it per se, but...
Yeah. Cocaine's not great for you.
On coke, you really notice it. So just before I was about to go on stage, it'd be giving this extra beat. And it's scary enough going on stage anyway, but with that, so that was what I call my anxiety period.
Right.
I then started worrying about my health. And in fact, as soon as I stopped drinking, I became a complete hypochondriac.
That's quite common, actually. I found that with clients that I've worked with, that actually, you know, they get into recovery and they're worrying about every facet of their health and get really health conscious.
Yeah. Because the booze takes all that anxiety away till the, you know, first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
But I discovered that, you know, I was constantly thinking about my health. And at one point, I couldn't even get up out of the chair to get a cup of tea, because I thought I was going to have a heart attack.
Wow.
And then I heard somebody at a meeting share that exact same thing. And a little light went on. And I thought, okay, I'm not alone. Yeah. You know, that's the main thing.
Yeah.
I think going to these fellowships and talking to other people, you realise that you're not on your own.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you're not as crazy as you think you are.
And you reference a lot anxiety as a kind of like a thread that runs through. You've not really mentioned depression per se. I mean, obviously you talked about it in reference to 5 years ago when you felt suicidal. Is depression a thread that's run through your life, or has it been more about anxiety?
No, it is. I think I have low-level depression. There is a term for it. I've forgotten what it's called now. But where you've got constant low-level depression.
Right.
I think I've always had it. And then my ex-wife reminds me that I used to ring her up from the petrol station and say to her, I'm just going to pour petrol all over myself.
Right.
And I'd forgotten about stuff like that. And then I went through this phase. I'm not someone who ever sleeps in. I've never did, even in my youth. But I went through a period in my sort of, I think, early 40s where I couldn't get out of bed.
Right.
You know, where I'd sleep till midday and 1 o'clock. And I know now that was depression. And also this kind of feeling that my life isn't complete. I haven't got the right relationship, you know. There's something missing. I've had that my whole life.
Right.
And since the therapy has happened, that's gone.
Oh, great.
And that's been the biggest relief of all, feeling like, you know, there's something missing.
Right.
So I think all of that is connected with depression.
I mean, all of this is, for me, like a complete story of bravery, you know, about getting honest, you know, going into groups, being honest with others.
Yeah.
Particularly maybe from an era where it was about, you know, maybe the stiff upper lip and not talking about these things. It sounds like you've always been willing to do that.
Yeah.
And talk and get to that place where you can work through things.
Well, I'm lucky. I come from a family that's like that. You know, I've got a very matriarchal family. My mother was a very strong woman. I've got 2 older sisters and 2 younger brothers. But of course, one of my brothers died just before I went to drama school. And that was also another big source of, you know, trauma. And I think I think
you were in your first year, is that right? You were in your first year of drama school.
I was actually just about to go.
Oh, right.
So he died on June the 15th, 1985. And it was a couple of months before his 18th birthday. So he had a very mild form of epilepsy called petit mal. And they put him on medication for it. And he was just very unlucky that the day he had his first grand mal fit, he was in the shower. So my mother came home and she heard the shower running and she turned on the hot water tap and it had gone cold. And she said in that instant she knew something was wrong. So I'm just about to go to drama school to follow my dream. I'm 22 years old and one of my brothers dies.
Wow.
So I think all of that trauma kind of kicked in. And also in 2019 when I was ringing the Samaritans, I mean, actually, that's only 3.5 years ago, but the 4.5 years ago was when I got into the relationship. But in 2019, my brother-in-law died, and I was right at the height of all of this trauma with this relationship.
Yeah.
So he suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack, age 59.
Right.
And I think that also triggered a lot
of course.
you know, trauma from my brother's death and all of that. So I think all of these things play into the melting pot.
Yeah, of course.
You know, but in between these times, I've been, you know...
Well, this is what I was going to ask you about, because, you know, often there's a bit of a stereotype that, you know, people that work in these industries, that's in some way to blame. And for a lot of people, that can be their story. But it sounds like for you, actually, that working in performing arts has actually been the thing that's really, you know, held everything together.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I think it saved me.
Right, wow.
Because I think if I didn't become an actor,
I
wouldn't have had the discipline of 3 years at drama school. I think my drinking would have escalated exponentially. But at drama school, you know, you have to limit it, otherwise they'll kick you out.
Yeah.
So I wasn't yet a fully fledged alcoholic when I was at drama school. So, you know, there was some external control, i.e. the environment I was in. So I had 3 years, as difficult as it was, I had 3 years of self-development, growing as an actor, learning the skills. And then the day I left drama school, I started drinking at lunchtime. Right. I was like straight up the pub,
right.
You know, to go home, bottle of wine. My drinking escalated almost immediately once that external control had been taken away.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I look back on it now and I think if I actually had discovered AA in my early 20s, I probably wouldn't have stopped drinking. But if I had have done, I think, you know, those times when I left drama school would have been easier to deal with.
Yeah.
But as it was, you know, you're just thrown into this melting pot of the acting profession. So I think the problem with being an artist isn't the art itself, it's the lifestyle.
Yeah.
It's what you do in between doing your thing.
Yeah.
Because when I'm doing my thing, I'm happy as Larry.
Yeah.
You know, even though...
And of course you get such a buzz being on stage, being on
Yeah.
camera.
Yeah.
They probably mimic the things that we were talking about earlier on.
You get the high, don't you?
And, you know, it would be quite easy just to kind of like look through your CV and just conclude that you've never been out of work. Do you know what I mean? And go,
You know different.
and every time we bump into each other, it's like, yeah, I'm doing this thing, and I sense that there's a massive drive about you to, you know, to get on with the next project and do the next thing. Do you find that you get a bit of a hit from that, like booking the next job?
I think there are three things actually that have saved me in my years when if ever I've been feeling down. This is going to sound weird. One of the things is football.
Right.
I'm an ardent West Ham supporter.
Yeah, I know. I knew that one.
And you're a big Arsenal fan. I know that.
So I'm a bit happy at that.
Top of the league. Mate.
Totally.
But, you'd think being a West Ham fan would be a depressing experience. But I go to these matches.
You had a good season last year.
Yeah, we did. And I went to Europe 3 times last year with West Ham. So that's a nice bit of camaraderie at the games. And the other thing, is acting and exercise. Those are the three things, because I still play football. Right. I ran a couple of half marathons over the last couple of years.
Is that what you do then in between jobs? Would you then just up exercise? Like, how do you keep your mental health in check in between work?
Exercise.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Eating, trying to eat properly. I mean, I'm still trying to lose the weight from lockdown. And as soon as my ex-wife vacated the premises, I started eating carbohydrates again. But I've got type 2 diabetes, so I'm supposed to be really careful with my carbs intake in particular. So I did put on a lot of weight during lockdown, so I'm still trying to get rid of that. Right. And I've just had a hernia operation as well. Right. So I'm still waiting to go back and play football again. But exercise.
So what do you do? You jog or you go?
I play football Sunday mornings, sort of 5, 6, 7 aside, depends how many people turn up. And then I go up the gym and I pump iron a little bit. And then before the last couple of years, I was training for half marathons. So I was getting up at the crack of dawn, running over Hampstead Heath, around Regent's Park. So I ran 3 half marathons, which was great fun, but a lot of hard work. Yeah. And now my knees are complaining, so I have to be careful.
And I'm just interested. I mean, I sort of got this... Maybe it's not a correct impression that maybe you don't have to self-tape too much, that maybe you're getting more straight offers. One of these lucky actors that the phone rings and they go, would you like to do this? Yeah. And that probably isn't the case.
No, it's not the case.
I just wonder, for anyone, particularly maybe younger actors or not, even myself included, like if you get a no, which obviously all actors do, we hear no far more times than yes. With the backdrop of everything you've spoken about today, how do you deal with that? Is that something you just got used to? Have you always found it easy taking a no on the chin?
That is a $24,000 question. And I was speaking to a friend of mine last night, a young actress called Emily Knutson, her name is. Lovely girl. She just got recalled for 3 London drama schools. Right. I think it's Bristol, not London, but Bristol Old Vic, Lambda and Central. Wow. And she didn't get into Bristol Old Vic last year after getting a recall, and she's in that headspace. When am I going to get in? When am I going to get in? And I said to her, Emily, you've got to learn to understand that recall is success.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what you have to do is just forget all of that stuff. Don't worry about whether you don't get the job or you do get the job. I mean, some people go, well, that's easy for you to say. You've worked a lot. But when you're first starting out...
Well, am I right in saying, actually, you didn't get into drama school the first round?
No, I didn't.
But now, if I'm also right, I think you are on the panel.
Yeah.
For drama school.
Central. Yeah, I was. I sat on the auditioning panel.
So, at the beginning, you didn't get in, and now you're actually deciding... And it just goes to show how things can just, with the right mindset, just flip around.
You got to keep going, and you can't take rejection personally. But the best advice I can give to any young actor... Do the self-tape, forget about it. Yeah. Do not get attached to that job. Yeah. Because I spent my life in my 20s and 30s fantasizing about every single audition I went for. And most of them at the beginning I didn't get. Yeah. So I was in a constant state of anxiety. Right. I mean, it's not so easy to do when you're younger. This age, I'll do a tape, I won't even remember. And my agent will ring me up and go, "Are you going to go to Rome?" This happened last year. She said, "Oh, you're going to Rome?" I said, "What was that for?" She said, "You auditioned for this thing, Domino. Do you not remember?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I did the recall when I was in Lyon watching West Ham."
All right.
So I had a Zoom recall. And I said, "Oh, I've forgotten about that." She said, "Well, you better remember because you're going to Rome."
Wow.
So I think it was April, I got on a plane, went to Rome and did this fantastic job.
Wow.
And I've only ever had a straight offer once.
Right.
And that was from America.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good place to get it.
Yeah, because I went over there and did an Odyssey, which I won't bore you with now. But he said to me, "Can you be in Cornwall tomorrow?" I was like, "Yeah." Wow. He said, "I've got you 4 episodes of a Netflix series called
Frontier.
Frontier."
Right? There you go. See, I've done my research.
You really have done.
I really have, haven't you? Pretty good. That's pretty good. And it was one thing that struck me as well is earlier you talked about how easy it was to go into fantasy about maybe relationships, or you even touched on it with drinking, that you'd have this amazing time, or you're already planning the wedding. How are you able to not do that with a part? Because they both give you a buzz. Have you just been able to sort of like compartmentalize the two as separate things? Yeah.
Well, I save my imagination now for when I actually get a job.
Got it. Right.
So now that I'm doing a job, it's working overtime, because that is our talent. I believe the creative imagination is the talent of the actor and the musician and probably every other artist. So for me, I have to save it now for when I've been told I've got the job. If I start fantasizing about something I haven't got, I end up depressed. Yeah. And that's why I think it's really important. You have to protect yourself. It's a form of self-preservation. So do the self-tape, forget about it, And I had a phone call from a friend of mine yesterday. He said, "I just saw you in that commercial that I auditioned for." Right. So he rang me up and told me all about his audition. And I said, "Oh, wow, that's amazing." And I'm doing a Birmingham accent in it, and he's actually from Birmingham.
That's one accent I can't do. I'm terrible at Birmingham.
I just had to go, "Lovely." But that happens sometimes, that a lot of your friends will ring you and you can tell that they're not in a good headspace because they haven't worked, and you're working, and that's tricky, and that happens to me as well. There are some actors, who I know personally and are doing so well, I almost can't look at them when I'm down. Right. Bump into them in the street and I sort of want to get away from them because I'm like so depressed that my own career isn't going well. So all you can do is try and keep yourself on an even keel. Right. And I know a lot of younger actors in particular, I mean, that's a bit of a stereotype and generalization. They really struggle around social media with exactly what you're talking about. Does that play a part for you? How are you with social media and the industry and stuff like that? Well, luckily, I'm from the generation that never had it, so it's fairly meaningless to me. I mean, Facebook is a tool for me keeping in contact with friends and family. No one would dare give me grief anyway, but if they do, I'd laugh it off. I mean, it's not something I ever get, annoyed about or anything like that. When people start posting all kinds of self-promoting, photographs or videos or whatever, and there are a lot of actors on my Facebook feed who are sort of in the middle of self-promotion. Right. And I just think, God bless them. I'm not going to criticize them, but that's not for me. Yeah. I prefer to kind of keep Facebook for friends and family. I mean, for this play, they've asked me to promote it on Instagram and Twitter, but I keep Facebook really for friends and families.
We can actually do that again, right? I'm just going to segue very easy into that. So everyone go and watch Jumping the Shark, written by my family writer, David Cantor and Michael Kingsbury. There you go. Was that so?
Yeah, brilliant. Very well done.
I'll get a graphic and just put it in. Yeah. Just before we wrap up, if that's all right. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You had a little bit more to say on that bit. If anyone's listening to this and they haven't got any of the tools that you're talking about, and they're feeling really depressed or really anxious, and they're maybe even feeling suicidal, what would your advice be to them?
That's a very big question. One thing I haven't mentioned is that I kind of have a spiritual way of dealing with things as well. Meditation is a big thing for me. Also, this idea of a higher power is kind of important to me. And it's not God. It's just a force stronger than me that I can tune into when I'm feeling at a low ebb. So those, that meditative mindset is very important.
Wow.
Because it chills you out, I think. But the main thing is not to keep it to yourself. Talk to people, pick up the phone to the Samaritans, to friends. Don't worry about upsetting anybody. And not last New Year, but the year before, a friend of mine posted on Instagram that she tried to kill herself twice. She lives in Stoke. I told her to get on a bus and come to London. So she laid on my sofa for 2 nights, sobbing her heart out. She's now in a much better headspace. And the biggest thing, she's actually had tattooed on her arm the following words: "This too shall pass."
Wow.
And that's what I would say. It's a temporary situation. Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. It will always get better. So when you're at your absolute lowest ebb, remind yourself that it's not always going to be like that. But the main thing is reach out. Don't sit there with it on your own. The Samaritans are good. Mind are good.
Yeah.
There are all these different places. We do live in an age of getting self-help, actually.
Yeah.
Therapy's great. I found therapy so useful. Go onto Instagram and find a meditation app. Key into that. There are so many different ways you can get help these days. If you've got a drink problem, go to one of the 12-step fellowships.
We're going to put all these links in the description as well, and in the details at the bottom. And anyone who wants to reach out to the Samaritans, the number is 116123. David, thank you so much. I mean, I think anyone listening to this is just going to go, wow, how brave and courageous you are just to lay it all out to help other people. I really, really appreciate you coming on here and talking to me. And, maybe I can get down to Bury St Edmunds so I can go and watch the play. Where are you off after that? Do you know?
So after Bury St Edmunds, we're going to Southend.
Yeah.
And then I believe it's Portsmouth, then Dartford. Then we're up to Crewe. Then we're going to Edinburgh.
Wow.
We're only in most of these places for a week. Actually, we're in Edinburgh for 2 weeks and Bury for 2 weeks, the rest for a week. Then we come back south to Tunbridge Wells, and then we finish off in Basingstoke. And it's all done and dusted by April the 1st.
Wow, there you go. Well, that's brilliant. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us
Pleasure.
today. I could chat for another hour with you. Honestly, it's been absolutely brilliant. So inspiring, and just thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
We'll leave it there. Thanks, David. Thank you.